As we mentioned at the beginning, although the use of JavaScript on the server or the desktop is growing a bit, still the vast majority of JavaScript applications are in the browser. The job of the JavaScript is to do tasks like this: reformat the HTML div elements so that they look like tabbed panels, or check if required input fields are empty, or make a network connection to the server, retrieve some data, and insert it into the page. So we need to load JavaScript in an HTML page in a way that it can be used later. The most usual way to do that is to put a script tag in the head section of the HTML page, and the script tag merely points at a JavaScript file. It loads the JavaScript file, it loads the function definitions, but it doesn't execute the functions until sometime later. So the purpose of this JavaScript file is to define functions or objects that we'll discuss later in variables, but those functions won't be triggered until something else happens. So for example, we can hook some JavaScript code to a push button. The JavaScript file that defines the functions is loaded by the script tag, but it's not until we press the button later that some of the functions actually run. Or the user mouses over something, or the user clicks in a text field, or some other user action. Now, we will see in a couple slides that you can also have inline script tags that execute as the page is loaded, but this is much more rare. The typical usage is load some JavaScript functions, run the functions later when the user takes some action. In some HTML versions, the type attribute is required. It's technically required in XHTML and HTML4, but it's not required in HTML5. HTML5 is the most common style nowadays and the style that I'm using in this lecture, so I'm going to omit the type attribute, highlighted in yellow here, in the later examples. And also, as a best practice for organization, it's much more common to put the JavaScript file in a subfolder. That subfolder doesn't have to be named scripts. It's sometimes named JS or JavaScript or something like that. But just for organizational reasons, you don't want to clutter up the main folder. And you do the same thing with images and style sheets. You don't slam them all in the main folder. You put the HTML files in the main folder, and you put the scripts and the images and the CSS files in subfolders. And so I'll be following that practice from here on out. Okay, so the most common approach is you put a script tag in the head section that loads a JavaScript file that defines functions and objects, but those functions aren't executed until the user takes some action later. Now, there's an alternative approach. It's much more rare. We won't be doing it very much, but I wanted to at least mention it. And instead of executing the functions later when the user does some actions, you can put a script tag in the body and put some JavaScript code right inside the script tag, between the start and end tag, and that JavaScript code would call document.write. That means generate some strings and insert the value of document.write into the HTML page at the location that this script tag appears, so that the HTML content is being built as the page is initially loaded. Again, this is much less common, but it's at least seen once in a while, so I wanted to mention it. So the idea is that you're directly invoking code that will run as the page loads, and the purpose of this code is mostly to build some HTML content. Don't use this approach for defining the functions. Use the previous approach, a script tag in the head section that refers to a JavaScript file. Okay, so here's a quick example of both approaches. So I have a function called getMessage, and the output of getMessage is just a string. You won $1 bazillion. To collect your winnings, send your credit card and bank information to such and such an address. The most common approach is you have a function that does something, but that function won't be executed until the user takes action. So I have a method called showWinnings1 that calls the alert method. The alert method pops up a very simple dialog box with a string. Well, this function won't be called as the page is loaded. This function will be called only later when the user does something like press a push button. But I can also have a function called showWinnings2. This one calls document.write and builds an HTML string. This function will not be useful unless you call it with a script tag in the body section as the page is loaded, because document.write inserts text into the page at the location that it's called. If you call it later after the page is loaded, it has no effect. Okay, let's make an HTML file that will use this JavaScript file. So in the head section, we will put a script tag, and the job of the script tag is to load the JavaScript file shown on the previous slide. It doesn't execute any of the functions from that file, it just loads the function definitions. Then I have a push button that uses the onClick attribute. This is something new, but we'll talk about it a lot more shortly. And this says, later on, after the page is displayed to the user, when the user clicks on this push button, run this JavaScript code. And if you recall from the previous slide, showWinnings pops up an alert box, a dialog box, and puts a string in it. And then finally, we have a script tag in the body that calls showWinnings2. showWinnings2 uses document.write, and so the output of showWinnings2 will be inserted into the page at this location as the page is initially loaded. All right, let's try this out. Okay, so we take the HTML file, we load it in a browser. The script tag in the head section loads the JavaScript file that defines the functions. And we had a push button. This is the normal approach. And the push button, after it's pressed, invokes one of the JavaScript functions that was defined in the file. That's the typical approach. The less typical approach is to have a script tag in the actual body that uses document.write to compute some HTML that's inserted into the page as it's loaded. So again, the bottom example where I use a script tag to insert content into the page as it's loaded is much more rare. We won't be using it very much for the rest of the tutorial. The more common approach is load a JavaScript file that defines some functions and objects, and then run that JavaScript code later when the user takes some action like pressing a push button or mousing over something or clicking in a text field.